Welcome to my channel! Today's story is about how a single broken cup ruined the life of an entire family.
My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old, and on the day my own mother, with a raspy laugh shared with our next-door neighbor Darlene, threw my meager belongings onto the dry September lawn in front of the house where I grew up, a house that, as it turned out, I never truly owned, I stood on the sidewalk, watched my grandmother's porcelain teacup shatter against the curb, and thought about only one thing. That very morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I had paid the final installment on the home equity line of credit my mother had taken out against that house 7 years ago, a loan she had stopped paying on long before I started silently covering the bills. I watched the wind catch the pages of my old recipe notebook, saw the first drops of rain begin to spot my scattered clothes, and inside me there was no scream, no urge to fall to my knees and beg, not even the bitter sting of injustice I'd felt as a child when I was locked in the basement for the smallest infraction. Instead, a strange, almost unnatural silence settled over me, so deep it felt like someone had pressed mute on the entire world, leaving only the sound of the rain and my own terrifyingly calm breath. It was then that I understood the thing that would, a month later, make my phone burn with 94 missed calls and force my mother, for the first time in 58 years, to utter the word sorry. But before I tell you what she screamed at my back as I turned and walked away, and what my silence ultimately wrought, write in the comments, what time is it where you are, and what city are you in? I'm genuinely curious to know how far this story will travel and where the people are who understand that parental love sometimes wears the mask of suffocating obligation. Now, let's start from the beginning. My childhood smelled of the damp basement where I was often locked as punishment, and of the fresh-baked cookies my mother made exclusively for guests and for my older brother, Brad. I was the second child, the unplanned one, the unfortunate mistake, as I overheard my mother tell her friends when she thought I wasn't listening, and that knowledge, absorbed with the formula I was given instead of breast milk because there was no time to fuss, became the foundation of my existence for the next 3 decades. Brad was the sun around which our entire family system orbited. He was tall, handsome, with an easy smile and the absolute conviction that the world owed him something simply for being born. My mother, Patricia, worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm, but every cent of her income, every bonus, every modest saving went toward paying for Brad's endless courses, his car, his horizon-broadening trips, and his failed business ventures, which collapsed with predictable regularity, leaving debts that my mother heroically covered using her salary and my child support checks. I went to school in mended tights, wore hand-me-downs from the neighbor girls, and knew by 6th grade that if I needed new notebooks, the only way to get them was to scrub floors in the apartment building down the street, which I did in the evenings while my mother and Brad watched TV and laughed at sitcoms. When I came home at 17 with an honor roll certificate and a regional math competition medal, my mother glanced at the papers, set them aside, and said, "Your teacher called, said you should apply to college, but Brad and I decided he needs it more right now. He's going to law school, and we can't afford both of you. You go get a job. Math's useless for a woman anyway. Guys don't marry girls who play with numbers." And so I went to work. First as a dishwasher in a diner, then as a cashier at a grocery store. Then, clawing every free minute from fate, I finished night classes in accounting and got a job as an assistant in the same firm where my mother worked, just in a different department so I wouldn't be in her way. The next 12 years turned into an endless marathon around a closed loop where I was simultaneously a cash cow, a housekeeper, a caretaker, and an interest-free lender for 2 adults who genuinely believed I was a nobody, existing solely to service their grand needs. I woke up at 5 in the morning to make breakfast for my mother and Brad, then rushed to work, where over an 8-hour day, I managed not only my own duties, but also quietly, through my access to shared financial databases at the firm, kept track of my mother's accounts because she had a habit of forgetting to pay utility bills, property taxes, and loan payments. Every month, like clockwork, a week before the due date, I would transfer the necessary amounts from my own checking account to prevent a lien on the house or Brad's car from being repossessed. I paid for the roof repair when a heavy storm caused a leak in the living room ceiling, and my mother, wringing her hands, lamented the unfairness of life, never once wondering how the contractors and materials had magically appeared. I bought a new washing machine when the old one finally died, and my mother proudly told the neighbors that Brad had splurged and bought his mom a helper, even though Brad was in Cancun at the time, traveling on money I had lent him until his next paycheck. A paycheck that, of course, never materialized, because his latest venture selling knockoff phone cases had failed spectacularly. I remember the day it should have all become obvious, but didn't, because human blindness fueled by arrogance can be stronger than any armor. I was 27, had just been promoted to senior accountant with a decent raise, and for the first time in years decided to buy myself something truly worthwhile, a new laptop so I could work from home and pick up freelance gigs in the evenings. I brought it home in a neat box, looking forward to sitting in my tiny room, more of a storage closet really, and finally tackling the complex spreadsheets that had piled up. My mother met me at the door, saw the box, snatched it from my hands, and without even asking what it was, thrust it into Brad's arms as he was heading out. "Claire, honey, you understand. Brad needs this more right now. He's got an important presentation, and his old laptop keeps crashing. You can earn another one. You're our smart girl," she cooed in the sweet voice she reserved only for my brother. I stood in the hallway, clutching an empty grocery bag filled with ingredients for the family dinner I'd planned, and watched Brad walk out with my new laptop under his arm without so much as a glance back, tossing over his shoulder, "Thanks, sis, I owe you a candy bar." That night, for the first time in years, I cried, but not from hurt. I mourned the part of myself that still believed my mother might one day look at me and see a living person with her own dreams, rather than an inconvenient mistake. I sat on the floor of my closet room, hugging my knees, listening to my mother and Brad laughing loudly at some stupid video in the next room, tears streaming down my cheeks, and I didn't wipe them away, letting the salt water drip onto my worn-out t-shirt. The next morning, I woke up, splashed cold water on my face, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and came to the only sensible decision. I stopped waiting to be seen and started doing what was best for me. For 3 years, I quietly constructed a plan that grew inside me like the slow unfurling of a night-blooming flower, beautiful in its cold calculation and deadly to those accustomed to feeding off my life force. I continued to wake at 5, make breakfast, pay bills, slip Brad pocket money, and listen to my mother's daily lectures about what a disappointment I was. Plain, unmarried, good for nothing except scrubbing floors and making soup. But alongside all that, using my professional accounting skills and a few very useful contacts I'd made at work, I began meticulously gathering documentation of my financial support for that household. I created a dedicated cloud storage account where I methodically upload scans of every receipt, bank statements with regular transfers to my mother's accounts and the mortgage company highlighted in yellow, photos of checks for major home purchases, and screenshots of text conversations where my mother demanded money for emergencies. Everything was sorted into dated folders, and I knew full well that if it came down to it, I could prove not only my de facto support of the family, but also, more importantly, the financial incompetence of my mother and brother. I learned that my mother, despite her bookkeeping job, had never learned to budget beyond her next paycheck, and Brad lived by the principle of figure it out later. Their entire financial house of cards depended on my regular injections of cash and my ability to plug the holes they kept creating. I started looking into the house documents, the very house we lived in, which my mother always called my fortress. I discovered that she had bought it with a mortgage back in the early 2000s, and all these years the payments had essentially been made with my money because I covered all the utilities, repairs, and living expenses, freeing up her paycheck to service the mortgage. Furthermore, 3 years ago, as the mortgage was nearing its end, my mother had forgotten to make several payments, and the bank had begun assessing late fees and threatening foreclosure. I had stepped in and paid the arrears and penalties from my own pocket to prevent legal action. Afterward, I had the foresight to have my mother sign a notarized agreement stating that I would cover the remaining mortgage balance, and in return, she would not sell or encumber the property without my written consent and would grant me a lifetime right of occupancy. It wasn't ownership, but it was a powerful legal hook. I knew that without my signature, she couldn't sell or refinance the house, and if she tried, I could easily challenge the transaction in court based on our agreement and the payment records. My mother had signed the papers without reading them, waving her hand dismissively. "Write whatever you want, just make sure they don't take the house." She had no idea what kind of leverage she just handed me. Parallel to this, I started changing my life outside the home. I enrolled in advanced certification courses, earned my enrolled agent license, and quietly began taking on private tax clients, telling no one about the extra income. I opened a separate account at a credit union across town and funneled all my freelance earnings into it, and within 3 years, I had saved enough to cover 6 months' rent up front and live independently without looking back. I also joined a local professional women's network where I met a sharp civil attorney named Rebecca Chen. Over coffee one afternoon, I outlined my situation in general terms. She listened carefully, nodded, and said, "Claire, you're clinging to relationships that died a long time ago. Legally, you have zero obligation to support able-bodied adult relatives, but if you want to protect yourself, keep documenting everything you've put into that property. It might come in handy if they ever try to claim you owe them something." I thanked her and continued building my cloud-based dossier, adding new files week by week. The catalyst, the scene I mentioned at the very beginning, happened on a Saturday, the 13th of September, a day that Darlene, our neighbor, would later call the day Claire finally lost her mind, though in truth it was the day I finally reclaimed my sanity. The morning began like any other. I made bacon and eggs for Brad, who would come home for the weekend to escape the city grind, brewed coffee for my mother, cleaned up the kitchen, and was about to head out for a client meeting when my mother blocked the doorway. Her voice was flat, brooking no argument, as she announced that I was going nowhere today because Darlene was coming over and I needed to serve the guests. I calmly replied that I had a scheduled appointment with a client. It was important and I couldn't cancel, but I would be back by 6 to help with dinner. My mother raised an eyebrow and let out a short, humorless laugh, the kind that had made my jaw clench since childhood. "A client? Listen to you. Claire, don't forget who you are. You've been pushing paper your whole life and never seen anything beyond your broom closet. What kind of clients could you possibly have? Go slice some vegetables while I'm still asking nicely." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ice spreading through my chest, and said quietly but firmly, "Mom, I really have to go. It's important. I promise I'll be back by 6 and take care of everything." That was my mistake. I gave them a chance to back down, showed the very weakness they had always mistaken for my entire being. My mother's eyes narrowed, her face turning cold and distant. "So that's how it is. Your mother means nothing to you. Well then, you mean nothing to me either." She spun around, marched into my room, yanked my jacket off the hook, grabbed a stack of my belongings, including my grandmother's teacup, and flung open the front door, stepping out onto the porch where Darlene was already standing, having arrived 10 minutes early and watching the unfolding drama with keen interest. What followed happened in slow motion, and I stood on the sidewalk under the starting rain, memorizing every detail, every word, every shard of porcelain so that I would never, ever allow myself to forgive this betrayal. My mother laughing loudly and exchanging comments with Darlene, who egged her on with cries of, "It's about time, Pat, get rid of the freeloader," threw my things onto the wet grass and asphalt. First my jacket, then the sweater I had knitted myself over long winter evenings, then my books collected from secondhand stores, then my grandmother's teacup, which struck the curb with a dull clink and shattered into tiny pieces. I saw faces peering from neighboring windows, someone filming on their phone, kids pausing to stare at the crazy lady, and for the first time in years, I felt no shame, no urge to disappear. I just stood there, watching my mother destroy my meager possessions with a kind of animal glee, and suddenly I realized I felt nothing for her. Absolutely nothing. A void, cold as deep space, filled the spot where a bruised, wounded, but still faintly glowing daughter's love had once lived. My mother, having thrown the last item, my old running sneakers, turned to me, planted her hands on her hips, and breathing heavily, shouted the phrase that was meant to destroy me, but instead set me completely free. "This is where you belong, in the gutter, and don't you ever set foot in my house again, you worthless piece of trash. Don't even dream I'll let you back in." Behind her, Darlene cackled with delight, adding, "That's right, Pat, sweep the trash out." I slowly bent down, picked up my surviving recipe notebook and the single photo of my grandmother that had fallen from a book, straightened up, looked my mother straight in the eye, and said just 3 words. My voice was flat, calm, almost lifeless, and it was that calmness, I was told later, that frightened Darlene far more than any screaming or crying would have. "Thank you for everything," I said, then turned and walked away down the wet street, feeling the raindrops mix on my face with something warm that had broken through the icy shell, though I refused to call them tears. It was just water, a physical reaction to a temperature shift, nothing more.
I left that evening with only the notebook, the photo, my passport, which I'd thankfully slipped into the pocket of my discarded jacket, and a debit card linked to my secret savings account. I spent the night at a coworker's apartment, someone who didn't ask questions, and the next morning I rented a small but bright studio across town, the very one I'd scouted a month earlier, sensing that my carefully built house of cards would eventually collapse. Only after securing a roof over my head and a stock of basic groceries did I begin what I later called cutting off the oxygen. That same day, Sunday the 14th, I logged into the utility company's online portal and removed my bank account as the default payment method for the house's electric, water, and gas bills. Then I called the mortgage servicer and informed them that I would no longer be making payments on Patricia Miller's loan, as I was not a co-borrower and had been assisting voluntarily. This was the crucial lever. My mother was the sole name on the mortgage, and now the full weight of those payments fell squarely on her. I knew she had no savings, and her paycheck barely covered her own expenses now that I wasn't subsidizing everything else. Finally, I emailed Rebecca Chen and asked her to prepare a formal notice of termination of our notarized agreement regarding the house, asserting that I was exercising my right to cease voluntary support and that any attempt to sell or encumber the property without my consent would be legally contested. I sat in my new, still echoey studio, sipping instant coffee from a paper cup, and with the cold curiosity of a scientist observing lab mice, I waited for the domino effect to begin. The first week passed in relative silence. My phone stayed quiet, and that silence was the best reward I could have asked for. For the first time in 12 years, I slept until 9 a.m., no alarm jolting me awake to cook breakfast for 2 able-bodied adults. I took a long shower, drank my coffee slowly, bought some essentials for the apartment, and even splurged on a new set of sheets, soft, with a small floral pattern I'd always wanted but never allowed myself because every extra dollar went towards someone else's debts.
Near the end of the week, the first text came from Brad, short and as entitled as ever. Claire, Mom said you threw a fit, but IDC. Send $200 by tonight. Need to go out with the guys. Urgent. I read the message, set my phone aside, and returned to organizing printed copies of my cloud dossier, sorting them into folders. A couple days later, Brad sent another. Yo, you ignoring me? Mom freaked and threw your stuff out. So what? Buy new ones. Send the cash. I didn't reply. On the 8th day after my departure, Darlene called. Her voice lacked the confident cheer of that Saturday. Claire, honey, your mom's beside herself. Their power got shut off. Can you believe it? The bill came and there's 3 months unpaid. Pat says you always took care of it and now you've stopped. Did you get your feelings hurt or something? She's your mother, for heaven's sake. So she tossed some old clothes. Big deal. You're a grown woman. You can't treat your own mother like this. I listened, leaning against my window frame, watching the autumn drizzle, and allowed myself a small smile, not of spite, but of the cold satisfaction a surgeon feels after a successful but difficult operation. Darlene, please tell Patricia that I'm no longer her personal accountant or housekeeper. If she has questions about her utility bills, she can contact the power company or ask her son, who is, I believe, a law school graduate. Let him handle the legal and financial matters. And I'd appreciate it if you didn't call me again about this. Goodbye. I hung up before she could protest. The second week brought the first truly serious signals. Deprived of my regular cash infusions, my mother missed the mortgage payment due on the 1st of the month. 10 days after the grace period ended, she received a call from the bank warning of late fees and potential acceleration of the loan, meaning they could demand the full balance or start foreclosure proceedings if the delinquency wasn't cured within 30 days. My mother tried to get a personal loan from another bank to cover the gap, but she was denied. Her credit score had been damaged by earlier late payments that I had quietly paid off without her knowledge, and now her debt-to-income ratio was too high without my subsidized household expenses. Brad, realizing there was no money, attempted to sell his car, only to discover that the vehicle was registered in my name.
Years ago, I had bought it with my own funds and titled it in my name to save on insurance, and Brad had never bothered to transfer it. Now he couldn't sell or use it as collateral without my signature, which I had no intention of providing. In desperation, my mother went to a payday loan storefront and, under crushing interest, borrowed a few $100s just to get the lights back on and buy groceries. That money lasted days, not weeks. I learned all this from text updates sent by the elderly widow who lived in the downstairs unit of my mother's house, a woman my mother had always bullied and called that old bat. Claire, dear, your mom and Brad are fighting like cats and dogs, screaming in the yard about how you left them penniless. Darlene's going around telling everyone what an ungrateful daughter you are. Don't you worry, we all know who is carrying who around here. Reading that message, I felt a small warmth bloom in my chest. My invisible labor hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. People just hadn't wanted to tangle with my loud, domineering mother. The third week brought the first real confrontation. My mother, having exhausted all other options, decided to confront me in person. She had somehow gotten my new address, probably through a mutual acquaintance, and one evening as I came home from work, I found her standing outside my apartment building. She looked pale and haggard, but her eyes still burned with righteous fury. Beside her, Brad shuffled his feet, hands shoved in the pockets of a worn jacket. "Claire, we need to talk," she began, stepping toward me. I stopped, maintaining a clear distance, and replied evenly, "I'm listening." She launched into a rapid, disjointed monologue, veering from accusations to pleas and back again. She said I had destroyed our family, abandoned my own mother to starve, that I was an ungrateful child and was obligated to come home and keep helping. Brad chimed in with mutters about duty to family. I listened without interrupting, feeling that familiar icy wall solidify around me. When she finally ran out of steam, I spoke in a calm, level voice. Mom, when you threw my belongings on the lawn and told me never to set foot in your house again, you made it very clear that you didn't want me. I simply followed your instructions. You are a competent, able-bodied adult with a grown son who is perfectly capable of working and helping you. I will no longer be doing so.
Our agreement regarding my assistance with the mortgage is terminated. I've sent formal notice. The house is your property and the responsibility for it is yours alone. My mother's face went pale and her lips trembled. You wouldn't dare. I'll take you to court. I'll make you pay, she shouted. I calmly pulled a folder from my bag, the one I carried for just such an encounter, and handed her copies of a few documents. Bank statements showing years of mortgage payments for my account, a copy of our notarized agreement restricting the sale of the house without my consent, and the bank's notice of delinquency. Go ahead, sue me. I will present all the evidence that I voluntarily, without any legal obligation, supported you for over a decade. No court will compel me to continue doing so unless you can prove you are incapacitated and have no other means of support. Given that you have a job and a son, your chances are effectively zero. Furthermore, if you attempt to sell or refinance the house in violation of our agreement, I will challenge it legally, and you will lose both the house and any chance of selling it. It's your choice. I saw the dawning comprehension in her eyes, the realization that she was cornered, and that understanding meant more to me than any apology ever could. Brad lunged forward as if to snatch the folder, but I pulled it back and looked him straight in the eye. Brad, I suggest you find a job and start helping your mother. Otherwise, you'll both end up on the street. I am no longer your personal ATM. I turned and walked into my building, leaving them standing in the rain. In the days that followed, my phone indeed lit up like a switchboard. Calls from my mother, from Brad, from Darlene, even from distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. I didn't answer. I read the messages as they poured in, anger, pleading, threats, curses. My mother wrote that I was killing her, that her blood pressure was spiking, that she wouldn't survive the shame. Brad alternated between insults and demands for cash. Darlene tried guilt, describing how awful my mother looked. I read it all, took screenshots from my cloud folder, and continued living my life. I went to work, spent evenings on my laptop picking up freelance projects, and decorated my apartment. I bought a new phone and transferred only essential contacts to it, leaving the old one at home as a collection device for evidence. 3 weeks after I left, the missed call counter on that old phone passed 94. I deliberately didn't clear the log, wanting that number as a reminder that to them, I had never been anything more than a resource. He stopped calling me, and I think he finally began to grow up. Darlene, realizing I was truly lost, stopped communicating with me entirely, which was no great loss. I changed jobs, moving to a better position at a mid-sized accounting firm, upgraded to a larger apartment, and started taking Italian classes in the evenings, simply because I'd always loved the sound of Italian love songs. One evening, while sorting through old things, I found the recipe notebook I'd rescued from the lawn. I flipped through it, and a yellowed slip of paper fell out, written in my grandmother's handwriting. Claire, my sweet granddaughter, remember, you owe nothing to anyone but yourself. Be happy, my girl. I read those lines, and for the first time in a long while, tears streamed down my face. But they weren't tears of hurt or anger. They were tears of release, of relief, of someone who had finally found her own path. I held the note to my chest and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma. I understand now." You know, from where I stand, this story isn't really about revenge. It's about recognizing your own worth and refusing to let others diminish it. My mother wasn't a monster. She was simply someone who had grown accustomed to exploiting my kindness and mistook it for weakness. When I stopped being convenient, when I removed the hands holding up their entire world, it collapsed. Not because I destroyed it, but because it was built on the rotten foundation of someone else's sacrifice. These days, I sometimes think of her and Brad, wondering how they're doing, but those thoughts no longer bring pain or guilt. I made my choice, and it was the only right one. And what would you have done in my place? Would you have given them a second chance, answered their pleas for forgiveness, and returned to that house? Or would you have chosen yourself, your freedom, and your right to happiness? Write in the comments. I truly want to know. Maybe some of you are standing on the edge of a similar decision right now, and I want you to know leaving isn't shameful. Staying where you aren't valued, that's the real shame. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an Italian verb conjugation to master and a batch of my grandmother's apple pie to bake using the recipe that miraculously survived in my old notebook. Life goes on, and believe me, it's amazingly beautiful when you finally become the main character in your own story.